October 1988. A 26-year-old woman vanishes from Reading, Pennsylvania. Her body is found days later in the woods. The killer walks free. For 34 years, her family suffers without answers. Then in 2022, DNA from a letter the killer himself wrote finally exposes the truth. This is the story of Anna Kane and the anonymous letter that sealed her murderer's fate. Before we dive into this incredible case, if you want more solved true crime stories where justice finally prevails no matter how long it takes, hit that like button right now, drop a comment below, and subscribe to Buried Secret Media. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next in this case. Reading, Pennsylvania. October 1988. A city of 78,000 people in Berks County, about 60 miles northwest of Philadelphia. Working-class community. Families who'd lived there for generations. The kind of place where people still felt safe, where violent crime was something that happened in big cities, not here. That sense of security was about to be shattered forever. Anna Kane, 26 years old. Long dark hair. Warm smile that could light up a room. The kind of person everyone gravitated toward. She'd grown up in the Reading area, daughter of hardworking parents who'd raised her with strong values. Kindness, honesty, compassion for others. Anna embodied all of it. Those who knew Anna described her the same way. Caring, thoughtful, always willing to help. The friend who remembered your birthday. The person who brought soup when you were sick. The one who listened without judgment when you needed to talk. She worked in the Reading area, building her life, making plans for her future. At 26, her whole life stretched ahead of her, full of possibility and promise. October 23, 1988. A Sunday. Fall weather typical for Pennsylvania in late October. Temperatures in the 50s, leaves changing colors, that crisp autumn feeling in the air. Anna had plans that day. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would suggest danger. Just a regular Sunday in the life of a young woman living in Reading, Pennsylvania. But sometime that day, something went catastrophically wrong. Anna encountered someone. Someone who would steal everything from her. Her life. Her future. Her dreams. Everything she could have been. Everything she could have done. All of it taken in an act of brutal violence. When Anna didn't come home, didn't contact her family as expected, alarm bells started ringing immediately. This wasn't like Anna. She was responsible, reliable, the kind of person who stayed in touch, who let people know where she was. Hours passed with no word. Her family started making calls. Friends, places she might have gone, hoping for a simple explanation, praying she was okay. By Monday, October 24th, Anna's family knew in their hearts something terrible had happened. They reported her missing to Reading Police Department. Officers responded immediately. A 26-year-old woman vanished without explanation, no contact with family or friends. This wasn't someone who ran away. This was an emergency. Reading police mobilized quickly, canvassed Anna's known locations, talked to everyone who knew her, tried to reconstruct her movements, checked hospitals, contacted surrounding jurisdictions, put out alerts. Time was critical in missing person cases, and they knew it. Every hour that passed decreased the chances of finding Anna alive. Anna's family couldn't just sit and wait. They organized search efforts, printed flyers with Anna's photo, that beautiful smile looking out from hundreds of pieces of paper distributed throughout Reading and surrounding areas. They called everyone they could think of, contacted local media. The Reading Eagle newspaper ran stories. Anna's face on the front page. Her family pleading for information. The community rallied. Volunteers joined searches. Local businesses displayed her flyer. Everyone hoped Anna would be found safe. But as days passed, that hope faded. October 27, 1988. For days after Anna disappeared, someone made a devastating discovery in a wooded area in Perry Township, a rural part of Berks County not far from Reading. A body. Isolated location. Remote. The kind of place you don't stumble on by accident. Someone had deliberately chosen this spot. Law enforcement responded. The worst fears confirmed. It was Anna Kane. She'd been murdered. Strangled. Her life stolen through brutal violence. Her body dumped in the woods like she meant nothing. The news hit Reading like an earthquake. Anna Kane, vibrant 26-year-old woman with her whole life ahead of her, someone's daughter, someone's friend, murdered. The community was devastated, shocked, terrified. If this could happen to Anna, it could happen to anyone. Reading police, working with Berks County District Attorney's Office, launched a full homicide investigation. Detectives started the painstaking work of reconstructing Anna's final hours. Interviewed everyone who knew her, everyone who'd seen her recently, anyone who might have information. They processed the crime scene where her body was found, collected every piece of potential evidence. This was 1988. DNA analysis was still brand new. Most police departments were just learning how to collect and preserve DNA evidence properly. The first conviction based on DNA in the United States had only happened 2 years earlier. But the investigators were thorough, professional. They collected biological evidence from Anna's body and the crime scene, carefully preserved samples even though current technology couldn't fully analyze them. They documented everything, photographed from every angle, made detailed notes. They were determined to find Anna's killer. Detectives developed theories. Based on evidence and Anna's movements, they believed she'd been abducted, assaulted, murdered, then her body transported to that remote location. This suggested someone with knowledge of the area, someone who knew about this isolated spot where a body might not be found for weeks or months. The investigation generated numerous leads, dozens of interviews, hundreds of pages of notes. Every tip followed up. They looked at everyone in Anna's life, examined strangers in the reading area, worked the case exhaustively. But despite their best efforts, the investigation stalled. No witnesses to the abduction or murder. No one had seen Anna with anyone suspicious. Physical evidence didn't point to any specific individual. Without DNA technology advanced enough to analyze the biological evidence effectively, without a clear suspect, the case began to go cold. Anna's family was heartbroken, not just by her death, but by the lack of answers. They'd lost their beloved Anna, and the person who killed her was still out there, still free, still able to live their life while Anna's had been stolen. The injustice was unbearable. The community held vigils for Anna, her funeral packed with hundreds of mourners. Friends, family, community members touched by her story. The church overflowed, everyone struggling to make sense of senseless tragedy. Anna was laid to rest, but questions about who killed her remained unanswered. Weeks turned to months. Case remained open, but active leads dried up. Detectives continued working it when new information emerged, but without fresh evidence or witnesses, progress stopped. The case file grew thick with reports, but didn't contain the one thing everyone wanted: the name of Anna's killer. Then early 1990, about 15 months after Anna's murder, something strange happened. The Reading Eagle newspaper received an anonymous letter, typed on a typewriter, not handwritten, harder to trace. But what made this letter significant was its content. The anonymous writer claimed to have information about Anna Kane's murder. The letter included details about the crime, some details that hadn't been made public. The tone was unusual, not quite a confession, but containing information that suggested the writer had intimate knowledge of what happened to Anna. Most significantly, the letter writer had licked the envelope seal and the postage stamp. In 1990, nobody thought twice about this ordinary action. Lick the envelope, seal it, lick the stamp, stick it on, mail it. But that saliva contained the writer's DNA, preserved on the paper, waiting for the day when technology would advance enough to analyze it. The Reading Eagle turned the letter over to police immediately. Detectives examined it carefully, noted the details, tried to trace where it had been mailed from. The postmark provided limited information. Typed text made handwriting analysis impossible. But investigators carefully preserved the letter and envelope. They recognized that someday, the biological material on that envelope might be valuable evidence. They had no idea how valuable. The letter generated renewed attention on Anna's case. Investigators followed up on the information it contained, tried to determine who might have written it. But without advanced DNA technology, with the anonymity provided by typed text, they couldn't identify the author. The letter was added to the case file. Another piece of a puzzle they couldn't complete. Years passed. Late 90s. 2000. DNA technology advancing rapidly. Cases across the country being solved using genetic evidence. Anna's family held on to hope that maybe, someday, the same technology would identify Anna's killer. But more years passed. 2005. 2010. 2015. Anna's case remained unsolved. Her family aged, carrying the weight of unanswered questions. Anna's parents, in their 50s when she was murdered, were now elderly, health declining. They desperately wanted to know who killed their daughter before their own deaths. Year after year, that answer eluded them. Original detectives who worked Anna's case retired. New investigators inherited the cold case files. Some reviewed Anna's case periodically, but the passage of time made it harder, not easier. Witnesses' memories faded. Physical evidence degraded. Trail grew colder. By 2018, 30 years had passed since Anna's murder. Most people assumed it would never be solved. The killer had apparently gotten away with it. Lived freely for 3 decades while Anna's family suffered without answers. What nobody knew was that the person who'd killed Anna died that very year. A man named Scott Grimm. He'd been 26 years old at the time of Anna's murder. Passed away in 2018 at age 58. Natural causes. Never arrested. Never charged. Never faced justice. Scott Grimm had lived in the Reading area in 1988. Known to police for minor issues, but never seriously investigated for Anna's death. He'd lived what appeared to be a relatively normal life after murdering Anna. Eventually moved away from Reading. Lived in other parts of Pennsylvania. Had relationships. Jobs. A life that continued for 30 years after he stole Anna's. But Grimm carried a secret all those years. He was the one who murdered Anna Kane. And he was the one who sent that anonymous letter to the Reading Eagle in 1990. Why did he send the letter? What motivated him to insert himself into the investigation, even anonymously? These questions would never be fully answered. But that letter, that seemingly pointless communication, would ultimately be his undoing. 2020. Investigators in Berks County began re-examining cold cases, looking for cases where DNA evidence had been collected but never fully analyzed with modern technology. Anna Kane's case was on that list. The biological evidence collected in 1988 had been carefully preserved. The anonymous letter from 1990 still existed in the evidence room. DNA from saliva on the envelope intact after 30 years. Detective Ryan Nase of the Berks County District Attorney's Office took particular interest in Anna's case. Nase was part of a specialized unit working cold cases. He'd made it his mission to bring closure to families waiting years, sometimes decades, for answers. When he reviewed Anna's case file, he saw potential. DNA evidence existed. The mysterious letter. Leads that had never been fully exhausted because the technology hadn't existed. Nase began by having DNA evidence from Anna's case analyzed using the most advanced techniques available. DNA technology in 2020 was exponentially more powerful than in 1988 or even 1990. Forensic labs could now extract complete DNA profiles from tiny, degraded samples that would have been useless decades earlier. The lab successfully developed a complete DNA profile from biological evidence in Anna's case. They also extracted DNA from saliva on the 1990 letter envelope. The two profiles were compared. They matched. Perfect match. The person who sent the anonymous letter to the Reading Eagle was the same person whose DNA was found in connection with Anna's murder. This was huge. The anonymous letter writer wasn't just someone with information. They were the killer. Now investigators had a definitive DNA profile of Anna's murderer. Question was, whose DNA was it? Nase ran the DNA profile through CODIS, the National DNA Database. No match. This meant the killer had either never been arrested before DNA collection became standard, or had died. Nase wasn't discouraged. He had other tools available. In recent years, genetic genealogy had emerged as a powerful technique for identifying unknown suspects. Investigators could upload DNA profiles to public genealogy databases where people had submitted their own DNA to learn about ancestry. If the suspect had any relatives who'd used these services, investigators could potentially identify the suspect by building a family tree. This technique had famously been used to identify the Golden State Killer in 2018. Since then, dozens of cold cases had been solved using similar methods. Nase decided to try this approach with Anna's case. Working with a genetic genealogy expert, Nase uploaded the killer's DNA profile to a public genealogy database. The search returned several matches. People who shared enough DNA with the killer to be relatives. Likely third or fourth cousins. This was the first step. Now the painstaking work of building family trees began. The genetic genealogist began constructing extensive family trees, working backward from the DNA matches to identify common ancestors, then working forward through generations to identify all descendants. The goal was to create a list of men who would be the right age to have been in the Reading area in October 1988 and who would fit the DNA profile. This process took months, required meticulous research, birth records, death certificates, marriage licenses, census data, obituaries, anything that could help build accurate family trees. The genealogist worked through multiple family lines, eliminating branches where all descendants were accounted for or were the wrong age or sex. Gradually, the list of potential suspects narrowed. The genealogist identified several men who fit the general profile. Detective Nase began investigating these men, looking for connections to Reading, checking if they'd been in the area in 1988, seeing if they could be eliminated or needed further investigation. One name emerged from the genealogy work: Scott Grimm. The genealogist identified him as a person who fit the age range, who had lived in the Reading area in the late 80s, who was related to the DNA matches in a way that made him a strong candidate. But there was a problem. Scott Grimm was dead, passed away in 2018. This complicated things significantly. If Grimm was the killer, how could they confirm it? They couldn't ask him for a DNA sample, couldn't interview him, couldn't prosecute him. But Nase was determined to get answers even if the killer was deceased. He began researching Scott Grimm's life in detail. Grimm had been 26 in October 1988. Same age as Anna. Lived in the Reading area at that time. Had some minor criminal history, but nothing violent. Nothing that made him a suspect in Anna's murder at the time. Nase tried to find sources of Grimm's DNA for comparison. Contacted Grimm's surviving relatives. Explained he was working a cold case investigation. Asked if they'd be willing to provide DNA samples. Some agreed. Others were suspicious. Wanted to know more about why their deceased relative was being investigated. One of Grimm's relatives provided a DNA sample. The lab analyzed it and compared it to the killer's DNA profile. The results showed a parent-child relationship. Strong evidence that Scott Grimm was the person whose DNA had been found in connection with Anna's murder. But Nase wanted more than familial DNA. He wanted a direct match. Working with investigators, he tried to locate items Grimm might have touched or used before his death. They found personal effects Grimm's family had kept. Located other items from various sources. DNA was extracted from these items and analyzed. Summer 2022. The results came back. The DNA from Scott Grimm's personal effects was a perfect match to the DNA from Anna Kane's murder and from the anonymous letter sent to the Reading Eagle in 1990. The match was definitive, scientifically certain. Probability of a random match, 1 in trillions. Scott Grimm had murdered Anna Kane and sent the letter to the newspaper. August 24, 2022. Nearly 34 years after Anna Kane's murder. Berks County District Attorney's Office held a press conference to announce the resolution of the case. District Attorney John Adams stood at the podium alongside Detective Ryan Nase and members of Anna's family. The room was packed. Reporters from local and regional media. Community members who remembered Anna. Advocates for cold case victims. Behind the officials was a large photograph of Anna Kane. Her warm smile. A poignant reminder of the person at the center of this decades-long investigation. District Attorney Adams began by acknowledging Anna's family and the 34 years they'd waited for answers. He outlined the basic facts. Anna's disappearance in October 1988. Discovery of her body. The investigation that followed. Then he revealed what everyone came to hear. Through advances in DNA technology and genetic genealogy, investigators had identified Anna's killer. His name was Scott Grimm, 26 years old at the time of the murder. Had lived in the Reading area. Passed away in 2018 at age 58. Adams explained how the case was solved. DNA evidence collected in 1988 reanalyzed with modern technology. Anonymous letter sent to Reading Eagle in 1990 tested for DNA. The two samples matched. Genetic genealogy led investigators to Scott Grimm. DNA from Grimm's relatives and personal effects confirmed he was the killer. The evidence was overwhelming. Scientifically certain. Scott Grimm had murdered Anna Kane. He'd lived freely for 30 years after her death. Died of natural causes without ever being held accountable. But the truth was now known. Anna's family finally had answers. Detective Nase spoke about the investigation. Years of work that went into solving this case. Importance of preserving DNA evidence even when technology to analyze it didn't yet exist. He praised original investigators who had the foresight to collect and preserve biological evidence in 1988. thanked genetic genealogists who worked tirelessly to build family trees that led to Grimm, acknowledged that while they couldn't prosecute a dead man, establishing the truth mattered. Then Anna's family spoke. A family member stood at the podium, voice shaking with emotion, addressed the room and cameras, talked about Anna, who she'd been as a person, the hole her death left in their lives, the 34 years of not knowing, of wondering, of hoping that someday they'd get answers. Today we finally know. We know who killed our Anna. We know his name. We know what he did. He never had to face justice in a court of law. He lived his life freely while we suffered. He died without ever being held accountable. But at least now we know the truth. At least Anna's name is cleared. At least we can tell her story completely. The family member thanked Detective Nase and everyone who worked on the case. Thanked genetic genealogists. Thanked the community for never forgetting Anna. Spoke directly to other families of cold case victims. Encouraged them never to give up hope. Advances in technology meant cases that seemed unsolvable yesterday might be solved tomorrow. The press conference ended with a moment of silence for Anna Kane. Room full of reporters, investigators, community members stood quietly, heads bowed, honoring a young woman whose life had been stolen 34 years earlier. The news spread quickly. Local media led broadcasts with the story. Reading Eagle ran a front-page story, the same newspaper that received Grimm's anonymous letter 32 years earlier. National news outlets picked up the story, fascinated by the detail about the anonymous letter and how the killer's own DNA on that letter led to his identification. Response in Reading and Berks County was intense. People who knew Anna, who'd been part of search efforts in 1988, who'd attended her funeral, relieved the case was finally solved. Anger that Grimm died without facing prosecution. Frustration that justice was delayed so long. But also satisfaction that the truth was known. That Anna's killer had been identified. That her family had answers. Some people remembered Scott Grimm or had vague memories of him from the late 80s. Those who'd known him described him as quiet, unremarkable, someone who didn't stand out. Nobody who knew him casually suspected him capable of murder. The familiar disturbing pattern. Evil hiding in plain sight. Wearing the mask of normalcy. Forensic psychologists and criminal justice experts analyzed the case, particularly the unusual detail of Grimm sending the anonymous letter to the newspaper. Why had he done it? What motivated him to insert himself into the investigation, even anonymously? Dr. Catherine Morrison, forensic psychologist who'd studied cases where killers contacted police or media, offered perspective. Killers who communicate with police or media often do so for several reasons. Some want to taunt investigators, demonstrate superiority. Others seek attention, want their crimes recognized. Some experience guilt, and the communication is a form of partial confession, a way to acknowledge what they've done without fully turning themselves in. In Grimm's case, we can't know for certain because he's deceased, but the fact he included details about the crime suggests he wanted people to know what happened to Anna, even if he wasn't ready to identify himself. Another expert noted Grimm's decision to send that letter ultimately led to his identification. He sealed his own fate when he licked that envelope. In 1990, he couldn't have anticipated DNA technology would advance to the point where investigators could extract and analyze saliva from an envelope 30-plus years later. He thought he was being clever, staying anonymous by typing the letter. But he left behind his genetic fingerprint. That letter, which he probably thought was a safe way to involve himself in the investigation, ended up being the key piece of evidence that identified him. The case also generated discussion about the role of genetic genealogy in solving cold cases. Anna's case was one of many cracked using this technique in recent years. Advocates praised the technology for bringing closure to families. Privacy advocates raised concerns about implications of using DNA databases for law enforcement purposes. The debate was nuanced. Everyone agreed solving Anna's murder was a positive outcome, but questions remained about broader implications. When people submit DNA to ancestry websites, do they understand this information might be used to investigate their relatives? What privacy protections should exist? How should this powerful technology be regulated? Detective Nase spoke thoughtfully about these issues. I understand the privacy concerns, and I think they're worth taking seriously. But I also think about Anna Kane's family who waited 34 years for answers. I think about all the families of cold case victims still waiting. Genetic genealogy gives us a tool to solve cases that were unsolvable just a few years ago. We use it responsibly, with legal authorization, following established guidelines. That's how it should work. Berks County District Attorney's Office confirmed that while Scott Grimm couldn't be prosecuted due to his death, the case was officially cleared. They'd established beyond any doubt that Grimm murdered Anna Kane. His DNA matched evidence from the crime scene and from the letter. The genetic genealogy work was thorough and scientifically sound. No doubt about Grimm's guilt. Investigators also looked into whether Grimm might have committed other crimes, examined unsolved murders and sexual assaults from late 80s and early 90s in Pennsylvania and surrounding states, ran Grimm's DNA through databases containing unsolved crime scene DNA, looked for patterns or connections. The investigation found no evidence Grimm committed other murders. His DNA didn't match any other unsolved cases. While investigators couldn't be absolutely certain, particularly for cases where no DNA had been preserved, all available evidence suggested Anna's murder had been an isolated incident. This raised questions similar to other cases. How could someone commit such a brutal murder and apparently never do it again? Answers are complicated, involving individual psychology, circumstances, chance. Some violent offenders commit one terrible act and then, for whatever reason, never repeat it. The specific circumstances that led to that act of violence don't recur. For Anna's family, knowing the truth about who killed her brought a measure of peace, even though it came far too late to prosecute Grimm. Anna's elderly mother, in her 50s when Anna was murdered and now in her 90s, was able to learn who killed her daughter before her own death. This knowledge, painful as it was, provided some closure. Anna's siblings and extended family worked to ensure she was remembered for who she was, not just how she died. They shared memories of Anna with media outlets covering the case resolution, painting a picture of a warm, kind, vibrant person whose life had been full of promise before it was stolen. Anna was so much more than a murder victim. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She had dreams and plans. She made people laugh. She cared about others. We don't want her only legacy to be that she was murdered. We want people to remember that she lived, that she mattered, that she was loved. The family also expressed gratitude to Detective Nase and everyone who worked to solve Anna's case. They acknowledged original investigators from 1988 who collected and preserved DNA evidence that ultimately identified the killer. Thanked genetic genealogists who built the family trees. Thanked lab technicians who analyzed the DNA. Every person who played a role in solving the case helped give them answers. Reading community also worked to honor Anna's memory. Memorial scholarship was discussed, something that would help young people pursue education or careers while keeping Anna's name alive in a positive way. Community members who'd participated in the search for Anna in 1988, who'd attended her funeral, who'd never forgotten her, expressed relief her case was finally solved. Detective Ryan Nase, reflecting on the case, spoke about what it meant to him personally. I've worked a lot of cases in my career, but this one will stay with me. Anna Kane was murdered before I was even born. Original investigators who worked this case, some are retired now, some have passed away, but they never forgot Anna. They preserved the evidence that made solving this case possible 34 years later. That dedication, that commitment to getting justice for victims no matter how much time passes, that's what this job is about. Nase continued. Scott Grimm thought he got away with murder. He lived 30 years after killing Anna, probably thinking he'd never be caught. But he underestimated the persistence of investigators and the advance of science. The DNA he left behind, both at the crime scene and on that letter he sent, that DNA waited patiently for 3 decades until the technology existed to analyze it properly. And when that technology came, it condemned him. The truth came out. That matters even if he's not alive to face the consequences. The case also provided validation for the importance of cold case units. Many police departments struggle to justify dedicating resources to old, unsolved cases when current crimes demand attention. But cases like Anna's demonstrate that cold cases can be solved, that families deserve continued efforts to find answers, that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied. Following resolution of Anna's case, Berks County District Attorney's Office received additional funding for cold case investigations. Other departments in Pennsylvania pointed to Anna's case as a reason to maintain or create their own cold case units. The message was clear: preserving evidence, continuing to work old cases, embracing new technologies. These things could bring closure to families who'd waited years or decades for answers. The Anna Kane case also became a teaching case for law enforcement agencies. Importance of evidence preservation. Value of genetic genealogy. Need to investigate even seemingly minor leads like anonymous letters. All these lessons drawn from how Anna's case was ultimately solved. Police academies and forensic science programs used Anna's case as an example of how old cases could be cracked with modern techniques. For the genetic genealogy community, Anna's case was another demonstration of how their specialized skills could help solve violent crimes. The genealogists who worked on the case, building complex family trees that led to Scott Grimm, took pride in their contribution to bringing answers to Anna's family. It was painstaking, time-consuming work, but when it resulted in solving a murder, the effort was worthwhile. The anonymous letter that Grimm sent to the Reading Eagle in 1990 became a focal point of analysis. Why had he sent it? The letter hadn't included a full confession, hadn't named himself, hadn't really helped the investigation at the time. It was a strange, ultimately self-destructive action. Some experts theorized Grimm had been experiencing guilt and wanted to acknowledge what he'd done without facing consequences. Others suggested he was seeking attention, wanting his crime recognized even if he remained anonymous. Still others thought he might have been testing the investigation, trying to see how much police knew. Whatever his motivation, the letter preserved his DNA for 3 decades. Every time someone licks an envelope or a stamp, they leave behind biological material containing their complete genetic blueprint. In 1990, most people didn't think about this. DNA analysis was still relatively new. The idea that saliva on an envelope could identify someone decades later seemed like science fiction. But by 2022, that science fiction had become science fact. The DNA on that envelope, carefully preserved by investigators who recognized its potential value even before technology existed to analyze it fully, had become the key to identifying Anna's killer. The Reading Eagle newspaper, which received and turned over the letter 32 years earlier, ran extensive coverage of the case resolution. Published original articles from 1988 about Anna's disappearance and murder. Ran retrospective pieces about how the case affected the reading community. Detailed how the letter their newspaper received ultimately helped solve the case. We receive a lot of mail over the years. Most of it is routine, but occasionally something comes in that has lasting significance. That anonymous letter about Anna Kane's murder sat in our files for years. Eventually turned over to police where it sat for more years waiting for technology to catch up. Now 3 decades later, that letter has helped identify a killer. It's a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary objects, an envelope, a stamp, can hold extraordinary secrets. The case generated interest from true crime media. Podcasters covered Anna's story. Television documentary producers reached out to Anna's family and investigators. True crime authors wanted to write about the case. Anna's family was selective about which media opportunities they accepted, wanting to honor Anna's memory while avoiding exploitation or sensationalism. When they did participate in media coverage, Anna's family emphasized certain themes. Importance of never giving up on cold cases. Value of preserving DNA evidence. Dedication of investigators like Detective Nase who worked tirelessly to solve old cases. And most importantly, remembering Anna Kane as a person, not just a victim. Scott Grimm's family also faced difficult questions in the aftermath of the case resolution. Learning that their deceased relative had murdered someone was devastating. Some of Grimm's relatives had helped investigators by providing DNA samples, not knowing what the results would show. When they learned Grimm had killed Anna Kane, they experienced shock, horror, and a complete reframing of how they understood their family history. One of Grimm's relatives released a brief statement through an attorney. "We are shocked and horrified to learn what Scott Grimm did to Anna Kane. We extend our deepest sympathies to Anna's family for their loss and for the decades they waited for answers. We had no knowledge of Grimm's involvement in this crime and are cooperating fully with authorities. Our hearts go out to Anna's family." Grimm's relatives faced the difficult task of reconciling the person they'd known with the brutal crime he'd committed. This is a unique form of trauma, learning that someone you loved or were related to committed a terrible act. Some of Grimm's family members sought counseling to help process what they'd learned. The case also raised questions about what Grimm's life had been like after murdering Anna. Investigators pieced together what they could from records and interviews. Grimm had apparently continued living in the Reading area for some time after the murder, then moved to other parts of Pennsylvania, had jobs, relationships, a life that appeared relatively normal on the surface. Had he been haunted by guilt? The anonymous letter suggested he'd thought about the crime, at least in the early years afterward. Had he experienced nightmares, anxiety, psychological distress? Or had he somehow compartmentalized what he'd done, sealing it away and going on with his life? Without being able to interview Grimm, these questions couldn't be definitively answered. What was clear was that Grimm never turned himself in, never confessed to anyone who reported it, never faced consequences for his crime during his lifetime. He'd carried the secret of what he'd done to Anna Kane for 30 years, taking it to his grave. Only DNA, preserved in evidence and on an envelope, revealed the truth after his death. As 2023 arrived, the resolution of Anna Kane's case stood as a powerful example of how cold cases could be solved decades after they occurred. The combination of evidence preservation, advancing DNA technology, genetic genealogy, and dedicated investigators had brought answers to a family who'd waited 34 years. Anna Kane's story became part of a larger narrative about justice delayed but not denied. Across the country, dozens of cold cases were being solved using similar techniques. The Golden State Killer identified in 2018, the Precious Jane Doe case, the April Tinsley murder, the Stephanie Isaacson case. Case after case, where genetic genealogy provided the breakthrough that traditional investigation couldn't achieve. For families of other cold case victims, Anna's case provided hope. If Anna's murder could be solved after 34 years, if DNA preserved in 1988 could identify a killer in 2022, then perhaps their own cases could be solved too. The message was clear. Never give up. Because technology and dedicated investigators might bring answers even decades later. The legal and policy implications of the case continued to be debated. Pennsylvania legislators looked at bills to mandate evidence preservation, to provide funding for cold case units, to establish standards for use of genetic genealogy in investigations. Anna's case was cited repeatedly in these discussions as an example of why these initiatives mattered. Victim advocacy groups used Anna's case to push for greater attention and resources for cold case victims and their families. They argued that solving old cases wasn't just about closure for individual families, though that was critically important. It was also about justice, about accountability, about sending the message that murder is never acceptable and will be investigated no matter how much time has passed. Detective Nase continued working other cold cases in Berks County, applying lessons learned from Anna's investigation. He'd proven that even very old cases could be solved with the right combination of preserved evidence, modern technology, and investigative persistence. Other cold case investigators consulted with him, wanting to learn from his success. For Anna Kane's family, life continued in the aftermath of the case resolution. The pain of her loss would never fully heal. 34 years was a long time to carry that burden. But knowing the truth about who killed Anna, even though her killer would never face prosecution, provided a measure of peace that had eluded them for decades. They could visit Anna's grave now and tell her they knew who had taken her from them. They could speak her name without that nagging question always in the background. They could remember Anna for who she was, the warm, kind, vibrant person she'd been, without that memory being overshadowed by the mystery of her unsolved murder. Anna's mother, in one of her final interviews before her own health declined further, spoke about what the resolution meant to her. "I never thought I'd live to see this day. For so many years I wondered if we'd ever know who killed my Anna. I prayed every night that God would give us answers before I died. And now we know. That man, Scott Grimm, he took my daughter from me. He stole her life, her future, everything she could have been. He lived free while we suffered. He died without paying for what he did. That's not fair. But at least we know the truth now. At least Anna can rest in peace knowing her killer has been identified. That matters to me. That matters so much." As of today, the case of Anna Jean Kane is officially solved. Scott Grimm, identified through DNA evidence and genetic genealogy, murdered her in October 1988. He was never prosecuted during his lifetime. Died in 2018 at age 58. But the truth is known. Anna's family has answers. Justice, though delayed and imperfect, has been served. The case stands as a testament to several important principles. The critical importance of preserving DNA evidence even when current technology can't fully analyze it because future advances may make analysis possible. The value of cold case investigations and the dedicated detectives who refuse to give up on old cases. The power of genetic genealogy to identify suspects that traditional investigation cannot. And the enduring need for justice, for answers, for truth, no matter how much time has passed. Anna Kane was 26 years old when her life was stolen. She was a daughter, a friend, a person with dreams and plans, and a whole future ahead of her. She deserved to live that life. She deserved better than what happened to her. And she deserved justice even if that justice came 34 years late. Her case has helped solve other cases, inspired investigators, brought hope to families, demonstrated what's possible when evidence preservation meets advancing technology meets dedicated investigation. That is Anna's legacy, not just the tragedy of her death, but the hope her case provides to others still seeking answers. The story reminds us that sometimes the smallest things, a lick of an envelope, a decision to preserve evidence even without the technology to analyze it, a detective who refuses to give up, sometimes these small things add up to something monumental. They add up to truth, to justice, to answers that families have waited decades to hear. Scott Grimm made a fatal mistake when he sent that letter. He thought he was being clever, staying anonymous, inserting himself into the investigation while remaining invisible. But he left his DNA behind. And that DNA, sitting quietly in an evidence room for 32 years, waited patiently for science to catch up. When it did, when the technology finally existed to extract and analyze that decades-old saliva, it told the truth. It pointed directly at him. It said, "This is the man who killed Anna Kane." The envelope, the stamp, such ordinary objects. We handle them without thinking, lick them and seal them and mail them and forget about them. But for Scott Grimm, that envelope became evidence. That stamp became a witness. That saliva became a confession that he couldn't take back, couldn't destroy, couldn't escape from. Even in death, that DNA remained. A genetic fingerprint left behind at the scene of his own arrogance. Anna's family often wonders what Anna would think about how her case was solved. Would she be amazed by the technology? Would she be relieved that the truth finally came out? Would she be at peace knowing that even though her killer was never prosecuted, his name is now forever associated with his crime? These are questions that can never be answered. But Anna's family likes to believe she knows. That somewhere, somehow, Anna is aware that justice found her killer even if it took 34 years. The reading community continues to remember Anna, not just as a murder victim, but as a member of their community who was loved and valued. Local events sometimes include moments of remembrance for Anna. Her name is spoken. Her story is told. She's not forgotten. And that matters to her family more than almost anything. The fear that Anna would fade from memory, that she'd become just another cold case statistic, that fear has been defeated. Anna is remembered. For other families waiting for answers about their own loved ones, Anna's case offers a blueprint. Preserve evidence. Advocate for your case. Don't let it be forgotten. Work with investigators. Be patient but persistent. Support cold case units and genetic genealogy efforts. Understand that technology is advancing rapidly, and what's impossible today might be routine tomorrow. And never, ever give up hope. The advances in DNA technology that solved Anna's case are continuing to evolve. What's cutting edge today will be outdated in 5 years. Cases that seem unsolvable now might be cracked next year or the year after. The genetic genealogy techniques that identified Scott Grimm are being refined, improved, made more efficient. More cold cases are being solved every month. More families are getting answers. More killers who thought they got away with murder are being identified. This creates a new reality for criminals. The old belief that if you could just avoid getting caught in the immediate aftermath of a crime, if you could survive the initial investigation without being identified, then you were probably safe. That belief is no longer valid. DNA doesn't forget. DNA doesn't degrade as quickly as we once thought. DNA can wait decades for technology to catch up. And when it does, it tells the truth. Scott Grimm probably thought he was safe after a few years passed. After 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, he probably stopped worrying that he'd be caught. Started to believe he'd gotten away with it. Maybe he convinced himself he'd been smart, careful, lucky. Maybe he barely thought about Anna Kane in his final years. Maybe the guilt had faded. The fear had disappeared. He'd survived, but he hadn't gotten away with it. He'd just postponed the day of reckoning. The DNA he left behind, on Anna's body and on that envelope, that DNA was waiting for Detective Nase to review the case, waiting for genetic genealogy to become a viable investigative tool, waiting for the technology to exist that could extract and analyze decades-old samples. And when all those pieces finally came together, the DNA spoke. It condemned him. It identified him. It exposed him. That's the power of forensic science combined with dedicated investigation. That's what happens when evidence is preserved and investigators refuse to give up. That's what justice looks like even when it comes 34 years late. It's not perfect. It's not what Anna's family wanted. They wanted Scott Grimm to face trial, to be convicted, to spend the rest of his life in prison paying for what he did. But he died before that could happen. Yet even in his death, he didn't escape. His name is now publicly associated with Anna's murder. Anyone who searches for information about him will find that he killed Anna Kane. His legacy is not whatever he thought it would be. His legacy is that he's a murderer. That's what he'll be remembered for. That's what history will record. And for Anna's family, that matters. The case also highlights the importance of anonymous tips and letters in investigations. While most anonymous communications to police or media don't lead anywhere, some contain crucial information. Grimm's letter didn't help solve the case at the time it was sent. But because investigators preserved it, because they recognized it might have value someday, it ultimately became the key piece of evidence. This teaches investigators an important lesson. Don't dismiss anonymous communications. Preserve them carefully. Test them for DNA. Document them thoroughly. They might seem irrelevant or useless at the time, but years or decades later, they might be exactly what's needed to crack the case. Grimm thought his anonymous letter was safe. Thought typing it instead of handwriting it protected his identity. He was wrong. The Reading Eagle newspaper also played an important role in solving this case. They could have thrown the letter away, could have decided it wasn't newsworthy or wasn't worth bothering with. But they recognized its potential significance and turned it over to police immediately. That decision, made by a newspaper staffer in 1990, contributed directly to solving Anna's murder 32 years later. It's a reminder that community institutions, media outlets, businesses, schools, everyone has a role to play in supporting law enforcement and seeking justice for victims. The Reading Eagle didn't solve the case, but they preserved evidence that ultimately helped solve it. That's significant. That's valuable. That mattered. As years pass and Anna's case recedes further into history, certain lessons remain vitally important. Evidence preservation is not optional. It's essential. DNA evidence must be collected at every serious crime scene. It must be preserved properly, stored in conditions that prevent degradation, maintained indefinitely. The cost of doing this is far less than the cost of unsolved murders. Cold case units are not a luxury. They're a necessity. Families of victims deserve ongoing efforts to solve their cases. Justice shouldn't have a statute of limitations when it comes to murder. Dedicated investigators working cold cases full-time, with proper resources and support, can make a huge difference. Detective Nase proved that. The resolution of Anna's case proves that. Genetic genealogy is a powerful tool that must be used responsibly. It can identify suspects that traditional methods cannot. It can solve decades-old cases. But it raises privacy concerns that must be addressed thoughtfully. Clear policies, legal oversight, respect for civil liberties. All of these must be balanced against the need to solve crimes and bring justice to victims. And perhaps most importantly, we must remember the victims as people, not just cases. Anna Kane was not just a cold case number. She was a real person, 26 years old, full of life, with dreams and plans and people who loved her. When we talk about cold cases, when we discuss investigative techniques and DNA technology and genetic genealogy, we must never lose sight of the human beings at the center of these stories. Every unsolved murder represents a life stolen, a family devastated, a community traumatized. When we solve these cases, when we identify killers even decades later, we're not just closing case files. We're giving families answers. We're honoring victims. We're demonstrating that every life matters, that every murder will be investigated, that justice will be pursued no matter how much time passes. Anna Kane's family waited 34 years for answers. 34 years of wondering, of unanswered questions, of carrying the weight of not knowing. That's longer than Anna lived. She was only 26 when she died. Her family grieved for her for longer than she was alive. Think about that. Let that sink in. 34 years of not knowing who killed their beloved daughter, sister, friend. But now they know. Thanks to DNA evidence carefully preserved in 1988. Thanks to an anonymous letter sent in 1990 and the DNA on its envelope. Thanks to advances in genetic genealogy. Thanks to Detective Ryan Nase refusing to give up. Thanks to all of these factors coming together, Anna's family finally has answers. It's not the ending they wanted. Scott Grimm should have faced trial. Should have been convicted. Should have spent decades in prison. But he died before that could happen. Yet even in death, he didn't escape justice. His crime was exposed. His name was revealed. The truth came out. And for Anna's family, that truth, as painful as it is, brings a measure of peace. They can visit Anna's grave now and tell her who killed her. They can speak her name without that constant, nagging question in the background. They can remember her life, her smile, her kindness, without the shadow of the unsolved murder hanging over everything. They have closure. Not perfect closure. Not the closure they wanted, but closure nonetheless. And Anna's story continues to bring hope to others. Other families waiting for answers about their loved ones. Other investigators working cold cases. Other communities dealing with unsolved murders. Anna's case proves that these cases can be solved. That time and distance don't make justice impossible. That persistence and technology and dedication can overcome even decades-old obstacles. So as we close this chapter on Anna Kane's story, we remember her not just for how she died, but for how she lived. We honor her memory by telling her story, by ensuring she's not forgotten, by recognizing that her case has helped solve others and will continue to provide hope and inspiration to those still seeking answers. Anna Jean Kane, born 1962, died October 1988, murdered by Scott Grimm. Case solved August 2022. 34 years from murder to resolution. But her memory lives on. Her story matters. Her life mattered. And the truth about what happened to her, finally revealed after more than 3 decades, matters too. Rest in peace, Anna Kane. Your killer has been identified. Your family has answers. Your story has been told. And you will never be forgotten. If you found Anna Kane's story compelling and meaningful, if you want to see more cases where justice prevails no matter how long it takes, I need you to do 3 things right now. Hit that like button. Drop a comment below telling us what you think about Anna's case and the incredible investigative work that solved it after 34 years. And subscribe to Buried Secret Media because we're bringing you more true crime cases where dedicated investigators refuse to give up until the truth is revealed. Cases where families get answers. Cases where justice, even delayed, is ultimately served. Don't miss the next one. Subscribe now.